So we were talking earlier about the whole issue of partisanship and bipartisanship of when it comes to Israel and America. Um, Before we jump into that topic, I wanted to just look back on the Trump era. I'm sure there were some things that Trump did with regard to Israel that you were supportive of, and you would have wanted to see any president, both Democrat or Republican, do. But I know you also had your serious concerns. So I wanted to know what do you feel has been Trump's legacy with regard to Israel? And I'd be particularly interested to know what you think about the impact of the Abraham Accords on Israel's kind of whole situation in the Middle East.
Yeah. So first of all, I think the Trump legacy, I think probably the biggest thing would, of course, be the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem and just the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Now, again, I'm going to be an Israeli who will say, I don't really need your recognition. It's been my capital since 1949, and nobody needs to tell us what our capital is. But it is obviously appreciated that countries have started to acknowledge that that's been the reality for 70 years and that they should move their embassies to what has been the capital of Israel for the last 72 years. So that's definitely a lasting legacy. And we see that the Biden administration is not going to reverse that. And I can't imagine that any administration moving forward is going to reverse that. So that will be a lasting legacy, no doubt about it. The other thing is, the Abraham Accords. I mean, there's no two ways to look at that. That has benefited Israel so tremendously. I would argue that I think the setting of the stage for the Abraham Accords came actually before the Trump administration took office. But they really heeded the opportunity of the growing Iranian threat that really was posing a threat not just to Israel, but also to the Arab world, that really brought the Arab world and Israel together in this kind of coalition against the growing Iranian threat. And so again, that had already started prior to the Trump administration, but they really heeded the opportunity and worked to get these governments to not just have this behind the scenes kind of alliance against Iran, but really put it in the forefront. And so that's definitely a lasting legacy. I teach now that the Arab-Israeli conflict is essentially in decline, and we could argue that we might be actually seeing an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, of course, we are seeing the growing Iranian-Israeli conflict, which is one of the reasons that the Arab-Israeli conflict is in decline. And of course, we're also seeing a continual Israeli-Palestinian conflict that's not going anywhere. And so those are two things that the Trump administration, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, didn't have really any impact on, because unfortunately, Trump moving the embassy to Jerusalem, for the Palestinians, they took that as he is supportive of Israel and not us, and therefore we're not going to treat him as an unbiased mediator. And so the peace process essentially stalled. Now, that being said, where was the peace process prior to Trump taking office? It had already been pretty much stalled. So not that much changed in that respect. This is a conflict that's in a stalemate, and the leadership on the Palestinian side hasn't changed in 15 years. And so that's not surprising. When it comes to the Iranian conflict, one could say that the maximum pressure policy against Iran definitely helped Israel, definitely helped in terms of holding off and really trying to prevent Iran from being able to create nuclear weapons. And so there are definitely positives, no doubt about it. Policy-wise, there's no dispute there. And the last thing you could argue is also the recognition of the Golan Heights. I mean, as part of Israel. Now, granted, we have to acknowledge that the Golan Heights was sovereign Syrian territory. Israel did take it in a defensive war. It was occupied territory, and Israel did annex that. And the only way for that to be really legitimized is for there to be recognition. But it is appropriate that people realize that the Golan Heights is necessary for Israel's protection, especially if Syria continues to be a growing threat, a base of Iranian operation on our border. And so that recognition essentially is positive in the sense that hopefully other countries in the world will acknowledge that Israel needs this territory for its protection, and that control and annexation should be recognized more and more. In terms of the damage that maybe Trump has caused, and this is where a lot of people argue with me when they ask me, what do you think about him? So I just told you the positives, policy-wise. Where I think Trump unfortunately harmed Israel unintentionally is public opinion. Look, the reality is that the right, the moderate right and the moderate left have been a source of support for Israel in the United States. We've seen that across the board historically. It's the extremes on both sides that, of course, have been challenging. On the far right, of course, we have anti-Semites, white supremacists that unfortunately, again, unintentionally were bolstered by Donald Trump and his rhetoric. And then you have the far progressive left, who also were given more of a platform because of him. And so my thing is the far progressive left, the squad and their followers are not going to be pro-Israel. They're not going to look at Israel in a positive way. They have been unfortunately commandeered by anti-Zionists and anti-Semites who have convinced them that Israel is this evil entity in the world, which of course is far from the truth. And we're not going to win over the white supremacists and the hardcore anti-Semites on the right. But on the left, there was a solid base that might not have made up their mind about Israel. But they did make their mind up on Donald Trump, and they despised him. And therefore, they despised everything that he touched and everything that he supported. And so just the fact that he supported Israel, I think, turned many of his detractors away from Israel. And so in the battle of public opinion, unfortunately, I think there was some damage done. And that's really it. I think it was 4 years, things ebb and flow in this conflict. The rhetoric today against Israel has grown, and I don't think that has anything to do with Donald Trump. I think that has to do with the new kind of world that we're in and the way in which social media is used to really indoctrinate people. And so that's a whole nother conversation. But I think Trump definitely played a role in terms of the polarization and, more importantly, the turning Israel into a partisan issue in America, which it isn't, and it should never be. It is very much bipartisan, meaning that there are Zionists on both the right and the left. Just like in Israel, most of us are Zionists, and we span the political spectrum from right to left, because Zionism isn't a conservative value or a liberal value. Zionism is its own ideology that can be held by both somebody on the right and the left, and we need to ensure that message continues to permeate.
What would you say? I want to touch on the whole issue of partisanship next. But what would you say to someone that says, because I would sympathise with this argument, that it tends to be, we've found in recent years, Republican presidents, or at least the last two, were vilified. George Bush was also really the most recent president. Recent Bush was really vilified. I remember protests whenever he'd come to London, and people sort of comparing him to fascists. And some people would say they feel like there's no doubt Trump's rhetoric, he was divisive, he was triggering, he was polarizing. But some people would say that it's likely that any strong Republican figure who made bold moves would trigger people to be against them. And this issue of the left being hostile to Israel, actually transcends Trump, and they would have just found they would have gone after anyone that was strong on Israel.
I think that's true about the far progressive left. I don't think that's true about classic Democrats or classic liberals. So I think we have to make that separation. And when you think about like George Bush, George Bush, and the reason why he got so much pushback was predominantly because of the Iraq War, right? Not really anything to do with Israel. And his support for Israel in that conversation was there, but it wasn't prominent. But more importantly, again, I think we cannot compare Trump to really any former president. He was just an incredibly polarizing figure and somebody who was so hated. I knew people who hated George Bush. I'll be honest, as a little 16-year-old, was I 16 in 2001, I protested, 2004. Yes, so January 2005, I protested Bush's inauguration, okay? So I wasn't exactly pro-Bush at the time, but he was not despised in the way that Trump was. And again, I'm not trying to make any commentary on this. This is, I think you would agree with me, right? Trump was an anomaly when it comes to the American presidency. And so really trying to compare him to past presidents just doesn't really work because he was so out of the box, right? He's an outlier, as Malcolm Gladwell would say. right? Not really worth taking into the larger picture of the American presidency. And my mentor, who's actually a historian on on America and specifically American presidents, he said to me during the Trump administration that his job right now is obsolete, that there's nothing to really talk about because it's so much an anomaly from what we've seen in the past and how American presidents have conducted themselves. So I think there was a uniqueness here that we didn't see in the past. But also, again, I think it's almost impossible to compare things that are happening today to anything that happened in the pre-social media age, because the way in which social media has really become a platform to spread political ideology and a very easy platform to spread lies or to take things out of context and really take the vulnerable Gen Z population and really take advantage of that short attention span has just created a different world than what we had prior. So again, the comparisons are very hard for me, but I don't think anyone would dispute the uniqueness of Donald Trump as a president and the impact that he had.